I am Julian, 29 years old. Exactly 6 months ago, my father handed our multimillion-dollar family auto restoration business over to my older brother and told me to pack my bags and get out of my own home. While I had spent my entire youth breathing life into classic cars, breaking my back to keep our family legacy alive and highly profitable, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "You don't belong here anymore, Julian. Preston is the future of this company, and you need to vacate the apartment by the end of the month so he has more room." They threw me out into the cold with absolutely nothing but the work clothes on my back and a few hand tools, stripping away my hard-earned salary and my rightful inheritance in one single calculated breath. They humiliated me right there in the home I helped maintain, laughing at my silent shock. But there was one major thing they did not know. I was not just some disposable grease monkey they could kick to the curb without consequences. I knew the true, hidden value of commercial real estate, legacy, and legal leverage. And right now, the very man who kicked me out into the street is blowing up my phone, sobbing uncontrollably and begging for my help. Before I tell you exactly how I legally evicted my own brother and father, hit the like button if you believe in true justice. And please, let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. Now, let's go back to where this entire nightmare began. It was exactly 2:14 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning when the cracked screen of my phone lit up the dark, empty corners of my new apartment. The caller ID flashed a single heavy word: Dad. I sat on the edge of my cheap, squeaky mattress, staring at the harsh white light cutting through the shadows of my bedroom. The vibration hummed violently against the cheap wooden nightstand I had found on the side of the road. It was a persistent, desperate sound that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. For a long, drawn-out minute, I just sat there. I did not reach for it. I did not move a single muscle. I just watched it ring, letting the harsh light burn into my tired retinas, counting each vibration. Then, the missed call notification popped up on the screen, immediately followed by the little red voicemail icon. I walked into my small, cramped kitchen, the cheap, peeling linoleum freezing against my bare feet. I reached into the cabinet, grabbed a glass, and poured myself a tall glass of tap water. The city outside was dead quiet, save for the occasional wail of a police siren in the far distance. Only then, leaning heavily against the scratched laminate counter, did I press play on the message. His voice came through the tiny speaker. It was raspy, completely broken, and utterly devoid of the booming, terrifying authority I had feared my entire life. "Julian, please. Something's happened. I really need to talk to you right now. It's about Preston. I made a terrible mistake. Please call me back. I don't know what to do." I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, letting the freezing liquid ground my racing thoughts. 6 months ago, that exact voice, even a fraction of that desperate tone, would have sent a massive, blinding spike of adrenaline straight to my heart. I would have dropped absolutely everything, rushed over in the middle of the night without putting on my shoes, and asked how I could immediately fix whatever disaster had struck our family. Because that was my only designated purpose in that household. I was the fixer. I was the invisible set of hands that kept the massive engine running, the one who meticulously cleaned up the oil spills and the financial messes while everyone else smiled for the local news cameras and collected the massive dividend checks. But not anymore. I let the heavy silence of my new apartment completely swallow his pathetic, begging words. I did not feel a single shred of guilt. I felt a profound, crystal-clear sense of boundaries that I had built with my own 2 hands over the last 180 days. To fully understand why a son would stand in a dark kitchen and completely ignore his own father crying on a voicemail, you need to deeply understand the absolute toxicity of the hierarchy I was born into. We were not a normal, loving American family sharing warm Thanksgiving dinners, discussing college funds, or planning summer vacations. We were a ruthless, cold-blooded business disguised as a bloodline. And in that family business, I was always treated as the major liability, the embarrassing background character, while my older brother Preston was the golden investment, the one who could do absolutely no wrong. I hit the delete button on the voicemail, watching the notification vanish into the digital ether, and set the phone face down on the counter. The worst part about deep family betrayal is never the initial, explosive anger. It is the absolute, terrifying clarity that comes months after the smoke clears. You realize that the people who were supposed to protect you, the people who were supposed to nurture you and guide you through life, were the exact ones holding your head underwater while complaining that you were splashing too much. And when the tide inevitably turns and they finally start drowning in the massive, catastrophic mess they created entirely on their own, your only obligation is to stay safely on dry land and watch. I was not going to call him back. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Because the storm they had brewed was just beginning to make landfall, and I fully intended to let them feel every single, freezing drop of rain before I even entertained the thought of offering an umbrella. I finished my water, rinsed the glass in the sink, and walked back to bed, sleeping more soundly than I had in 29 years. Growing up in the Taylor family meant growing up smelling permanently like motor oil, rich exhaust, and expensive old leather. My grandfather, Vincent, started the shop from absolute scratch after returning from the war. It was not just a garage to him. It was a sacred sanctuary for high-end automotive royalty. When I was a little kid, barely tall enough to see over the massive chrome fenders, Grandpa Vincent used to walk me slowly through the service bays. He had these massive, heavily calloused hands that felt like rough sandpaper against my skin, and he would rest them heavily and warmly on my small shoulder. I vividly remember the crisp autumn day. He showed me a pristine, vintage Rolls-Royce that had been sitting in a barn for 40 years. He told me to close my eyes, place my hand flat on the freezing metal hood, and just listen to the quiet, rhythmic purr of the engine. He taught me that these incredible machines had real souls, that they breathed just like we do, and our highest duty was to honor their history. He was a man of absolute integrity. A man whose firm handshake was an ironclad contract that held more weight than any corporate lawyer's paperwork. But when he tragically passed away, the true, beating heart of the shop died and was buried right alongside him at his funeral. My father, Victor, eagerly took over the growing empire. Victor was a man who cared infinitely more about maintaining his elite country club memberships, dominating the local HOA meetings, and projecting the glossy, flawless appearance of immense wealth than the actual grit, sweat, and grease of the hard work that paid for it all. And to Victor, my older brother Preston was the perfect, flawless heir to the throne. Preston was exactly 2 years older than me, but he lived in a completely different universe. He was tall, traditionally handsome in a very generic way, with a charming, incredibly easy smile that could sell a completely broken alternator to a seasoned, highly skeptical mechanic. Preston wore expensive, tailored designer suits to the dirty shop floor. He spent his long days taking wealthy, gullible clients out to incredibly expensive, boozy lunches on the company credit card, sipping top-shelf scotch and talking a massive game about restorations he didn't even understand. I was his exact polar opposite. I lived in heavy, stained canvas coveralls. I stayed late every single night, long after the showroom lights were turned off, meticulously tuning complex carburetors, manually managing the massive, complicated inventory system, and making sure the actual, grueling physical work got done so we could meet our strict deadlines. I naively, stupidly thought that if I just worked hard enough, if I generated enough pure profit and kept the clients happy, my father would eventually see my true value. I thought he would look past the grease on my face and see the dedication in my heart. I was so incredibly wrong. The toxic, deeply ingrained golden child dynamic became painfully, violently clear when I was just 16 years old. Preston, who had just gotten his license, had taken a highly valued VIP client's pristine, classic Porsche 911 out for what he casually called a diagnostic test drive. In reality, he took it out to show off to his high school girlfriend and her popular friends at a crowded local diner. He brought it back 3 hours later with a massive, jagged, horrifyingly deep scratch running down the entire passenger side door, completely ruining the original, irreplaceable factory paint. I was in the back of the shop, quietly sweeping the dusty concrete floors, when my father walked in, saw the catastrophic damage, and completely lost his mind. Victor's face turned a dangerous, deep shade of purple. Before I could even open my mouth to ask what happened, Preston pointed his finger right at my chest without a second of hesitation and said, "Julian aggressively bumped it with the heavy metal tool cart while he was carelessly moving things around. I told him to watch out, but he didn't listen. My father did not ask for my side of the story. He did not check the shop security cameras. He marched over, grabbed me violently by the collar of my worn shirt, dragged me roughly into the glass-walled main office in full view of 3 other senior mechanics, and screamed at me for 20 straight minutes about how I was a careless, stupid, worthless liability to the respected family name. He officially docked my already incredibly meager pay for 6 straight months to cover the premium, high-end paint job. Preston just stood in the hallway, casually leaning against the wall, sipping a cold soda, watching me take the absolute, humiliating fall for his reckless arrogance. He actually smiled at me when my father wasn't looking. That single, defining incident was the exact blueprint of our entire lives together. When I was 27, our shop landed a massive, potentially career-defining contract to fully restore a rare, severely damaged Lamborghini Miura. The specific internal parts were almost impossible to find, practically ghosts in the elite automotive world. I spent 3 grueling, sleepless nights sitting at my computer, calling obscure, private suppliers across the globe, leveraging every single personal connection I had painstakingly built over the years. I finally secured the exact original components we needed from a reclusive collector in Italy, negotiating the price down to save the company thousands. I rebuilt that massive, complicated engine with my own 2 hands, literally bleeding over the sharp metal. It was my absolute masterpiece. The day the high-profile client came to pick it up, Victor stood in the pristine, brightly lit showroom, put his heavy arm proudly around Preston's shoulder, and told the client loudly, "My boy Preston here moved absolute mountains to get this done for you. He personally orchestrated the entire build and tracked down parts no one else could find. He's got a real, undeniable gift for leadership." I was standing exactly 15 feet away in the shadows of the garage door, covered in engine grease, sweat, and exhaustion. I looked at my mother, Sylvia, who was standing nearby holding her expensive designer handbag, desperately hoping she would say something, anything, to defend my honor. She just offered a tight, perfectly practiced polite smile and casually adjusted her heavy pearl necklace. The ultimate, catastrophic breaking point arrived exactly a year later. I was 28, living in the small, drafty, freezing 1-bedroom apartment directly above the main garage. I did not have much of a salary, just enough to buy groceries and cheap tools. I had absolutely no 401k, no real healthcare benefits, and certainly no ownership stake in the company I was single-handedly keeping afloat. But I stayed because I genuinely loved the cars, and I clung to the pathetic, deeply delusional hope that my family would eventually wake up and respect my relentless dedication. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in late November. My mother had cooked an elaborate, massive roast dinner, which was highly unusual. Normally, our family dinners were tense, completely silent affairs where the sharp clinking of expensive silverware against china was the only conversation permitted. This time, Preston was practically vibrating with smug, barely contained, arrogant energy in his seat at the head of the table. Victor forcefully cleared his throat loudly and tapped his expensive silver fork against his crystal water glass to command the room. "I've called this mandatory family meeting because I've made a final, official decision regarding the future of our legacy," Victor announced, his chest puffed out with absolute, undeniable authority. "I am officially stepping back from daily operations to enjoy my retirement. I've formally transferred the majority ownership, all the voting rights, and the total, unquestioned control of the business directly to Preston. He is the new CEO of Taylor Auto." I completely stopped chewing my food. I looked directly at Victor, my heart pounding violently against my ribs, waiting for the part where he mentioned my new role. The promotion to head mechanic I had clearly earned with my blood and sweat. The equity I deserved after a decade of breaking my back to inflate his profit margins. Furthermore, Victor continued, his cold, dead eyes finally locking onto mine with absolute, chilling indifference, "Preston is going to need the apartment above the garage to completely gut and remodel into his new executive suite and entertainment lounge. So, Julian, you'll need to pack your things and completely vacate the premises by the end of this month. It's time you finally step out of our shadow and figure out your own path in life." The silence in that dining room was utterly, completely deafening. I looked at Preston, who was completely failing to hide a massive, arrogant, teeth-baring grin. I looked at my mother, Sylvia. She deliberately kept her eyes glued to her expensive china plate, meticulously cutting a tiny, perfectly square piece of carrot, completely complicit in throwing her youngest son out into the freezing street with absolutely nothing. They fully expected me to beg. They expected me to yell, to throw a massive tantrum, to demand a lawyer, to fight tooth and nail for my rightful inheritance. But looking at the three of them sitting there in their comfortable, wealthy ignorance, a chilling, absolute realization washed over my entire body. These people did not love me. They never did. I was just a utility, a cheap tool in their shed, and now they firmly believed they did not need me anymore. I did not say a single word. I did not shed a single tear. I stood up from the heavy oak table, my chair scraping loudly and violently against the hardwood floor. I walked straight upstairs to the freezing apartment. I grabbed a single canvas duffel bag, quickly packed my clothes, my grandfather's vintage wrenches, and my cheap laptop. I walked down the back metal stairs, got into my beat-up, reliable truck, and drove away into the pitch-black night. No goodbyes, no arguments, just absolute, terrifying freedom. The first few agonizing weeks on my own were brutally, relentlessly difficult. I rented a tiny, cramped, deeply depressing room in a neighboring town, 50 long miles away from the looming shadow of my wealthy family. I completely swallowed my pride and took a basic, ground-level job at a small, struggling independent garage located next to a rundown strip mall. Nobody there knew my last name. Nobody there cared about the massive legacy I came from or the immense wealth my family hoarded. They only cared about what I could actually do with a wrench in my hand and a diagnostic scanner. And for the very first time in my entire adult life, my skill alone was more than enough. Within 3 incredibly short months, my new boss, an older guy named Hank, realized I could effortlessly handle the highly complex electronic diagnostics that completely baffled his senior mechanics. I was quickly given my own dedicated prime service bay, a significant life-changing raise, and total creative autonomy. But I deeply needed a creative outlet, something that was entirely mine, a project no one in my family could ever steal, ruin, or slap their name on. I started a YouTube channel. I set up a cheap second-hand camera on a wobbly tripod in the dark corner of my bay and recorded myself doing a complete, meticulous 100-hour teardown and rebuild of a vintage Porsche engine. I did not show my face at first. I just filmed my calloused hands, narrating the complex process, explaining the deep, historical soul of the machine exactly the way my grandfather had patiently taught me all those years ago. The internet is a fascinating, wildly unpredictable thing. People deeply crave raw authenticity. The first video hit 50,000 views in a single week. Then it rapidly climbed to 500,000. The comment section was flooded with people praising my attention to detail. When I uploaded a massive, multi-part, beautifully edited series detailing the grueling restoration of a flooded Ferrari, the channel absolutely exploded overnight. Major automotive sponsors reached out. High-end tool companies sent me thousands of dollars in free, top-of-the-line gear just for a brief 10-second shout-out. I was not making millions yet, but I was building a fiercely loyal community, an audience of purists who deeply respected my craft and my integrity. I even confidently took on a young apprentice, a quiet kid named Lucas, who reminded me entirely of myself at 19, eager, highly observant, just wanting to learn the honest trade without the toxic politics. I truly, genuinely thought I had successfully left the toxicity in the rearview mirror. I thought the worst chapter of my life was finally over, permanently closed. I was so incredibly, dangerously wrong. Exactly 6 months after I left my family's home, I was grabbing a black coffee at a cheap, neon-lit diner near my new shop when I heard a familiar voice softly call my name. I turned around and saw Nolan. Nolan was a master mechanic who had worked at my family's shop for over 20 years. He was a rock-solid guy, the kind who practically bled motor oil. But right now, standing in the diner, he looked completely exhausted, much older than I remembered, his eyes carrying heavy, dark bags. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, shaking his head slowly. "Julian, man, it's really bad over there," Nolan said, keeping his voice extremely low, almost a fearful whisper. "Preston is running the entire place straight into the ground. He fired 2 of the best senior techs because they flat out refused to wear his stupid, overpriced, branded polo shirts on the dirty shop floor. He turned the main, pristine service bay into a literal photo studio for his new girlfriend, Gemma. She brings her ridiculous, loud influencer friends around every single day to pose on the hoods of million-dollar customer cars. He's taking months to finish basic tune-ups, and the VIP clients are absolutely furious. They are threatening to pull their entire collections." I felt a sharp, painful pang of profound sadness for my grandfather's legacy, a legacy built on hard work being destroyed by sheer vanity, but I forced my face to remain completely neutral. "That is not my problem anymore, Nolan. I don't work for Victor. I don't work for Preston. It gets much worse, kid." Nolan leaned in closer, his voice grim and urgent. "I quit last week. I couldn't take the disrespect anymore. The vendors are calling the front desk nonstop. They aren't getting paid for parts they delivered months ago. The massive inventory accounts are totally frozen. The place is bleeding cash faster than they can print it." That fully explained the sudden, desperate influx of missed calls and those pathetic, weeping voicemails from my father. The golden child was rapidly tarnishing the crown, and the king was finally panicking as his kingdom burned. But the true, horrifying depth of Preston's depravity did not hit me until exactly 3 days later. I received a blocked phone call while I was deep under the chassis of a Mustang. I wiped my greasy hands on a rag and answered. It was Fiona, the senior accountant who had meticulously managed our family shop's books for a decade. She was a quiet, strictly professional woman who had always treated me with basic human decency when my family wouldn't. "Julian," she whispered breathlessly, sounding absolutely terrified, like she was hiding in a closet. "I should not be calling you. It completely violates my non-disclosure contract, but I couldn't sleep. You need to hire a ruthless lawyer and protect yourself right now." "Fiona? Slow down. Take a breath. What are you talking about?" I asked, stepping out of the noisy, clanging garage into the quiet, desolate back alley. "Preston has completely drained the main operating accounts," she said, her voice trembling with severe anxiety. "He bought a brand new luxury sports car under the company name, claimed it was a necessary promotional vehicle for tax purposes. He's been illegally funneling massive amounts of cash to Gemma's marketing agency, which doesn't even exist as a registered LLC. It's a total shell company. But Julian, to cover these massive, gaping holes in the balance sheet, he's been forging official documents." My blood ran completely cold. The alley suddenly felt freezing. "Forging what, Fiona? Tell me exactly." "He fabricated dozens of high-value purchase orders and expensive supplier contracts. He's explicitly telling your father and the external auditors that these are massive outstanding debts from unauthorized specialty parts you supposedly ordered right before you were fired. He's pinning the entire financial ruin of the company directly on you. He's successfully gaslighting your dad into believing you intentionally sabotaged the company out of spite before you left." I gripped the phone so incredibly hard my knuckles turned completely white. He was not just failing as a businessman. He was actively, maliciously framing me for his own federal financial crimes to maintain his perfect, untouchable image in Victor's eyes. He was fully willing to send his own brother to prison to save his own skin. Before I could even fully process the sheer magnitude of this sociopathic betrayal, the final, fatal blow landed. When I got home to my apartment that evening, there was a thick, heavy, certified envelope waiting inside my mailbox. The embossed return address belonged to a notoriously aggressive, high-powered corporate law firm in the city. I tore the thick paper open. It was a formal extortion letter masterfully masked as a threat of a massive civil lawsuit. Preston was officially threatening to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, gross theft of company property, and intentional corporate sabotage. The heavily worded letter demanded I pay a settlement of $200,000 immediately to make the family whole, or they would drag me into court, aggressively drain my finances in legal fees, and completely ruin my growing professional reputation publicly in the industry. He actually thought I was still the quiet, terrified little brother who would just put his head down, apologize for existing, and take the brutal beating. He thought a legal threat on fancy paper would easily scare me into emptying my hard-earned savings and taking out predatory loans to cover his massive theft. He wanted to bleed me completely dry. I did not panic. I did not cry. I did not throw a tantrum. I walked calmly over to my small desk, turned on my laptop, and looked at the very healthy balances in my bank accounts. Then I looked at the private business card Fiona had quietly slipped into a secure email for me months ago. Preston had crossed a massive legal and moral line that could never, ever be uncrossed. It was no longer about just walking away and finding peace. It was about absolute, surgical, devastating retaliation. The absolute center of a hurricane is terrifyingly calm. There is absolutely no wind, no rain, just a heavy, suffocating silence before the brutal back half of the storm rips everything to shreds. That is exactly where I was operating from. I did not reply to the aggressive lawyer's letter. I did not answer my father's increasingly frantic, tearful voicemails. I completely ignored the bait. Instead, I went straight to work building an impenetrable, heavily fortified fortress. My very first strategic move was to secure my high-value alliances. I personally arranged a private, unlisted meeting with Mr. Harrison, one of the wealthiest men in the state and an absolute fanatic collector of million-dollar vintage Ferraris and Porsches. He was the family shop's single biggest VIP client, a self-made man who deeply respected hard work, grease, and raw honesty over flashy PowerPoint presentations and expensive lunches. I met him at a quiet, upscale diner on the wealthy edge of town. I did not complain about my toxic family. I did not whine about the unfairness of my situation. I simply laid out my brand new, comprehensive, highly detailed business plan. I showed him the impressive analytics and massive global reach of my YouTube channel, and I offered to personally manage his entire private collection under my newly formed LLC, which I proudly named Legacy Restorations. Mr. Harrison looked at me intently over the rim of his black coffee, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Your arrogant brother tried to charge me a ridiculous 20% markup for expedited climate-controlled storage last month. Harrison grumbled, his voice laced with absolute disgust. The boy is a complete clown. He doesn't know a spark plug from a lug nut, and he treats my cars like props for his Instagram. Send a secure transport truck to my estate tomorrow morning, Julian. My cars are officially yours to manage. Exclusive contract. With the massive financial anchor of a VIP client fully secured, I immediately reached out to Clara, the highly efficient, incredibly organized former receptionist Preston had illegally fired for flat-out refusing to fetch his girlfriend's dry cleaning during work hours. I hired her on the spot with a massive pay bump and full benefits to flawlessly manage my new front office operations. Then I brought Nolan on as my absolute lead tech, offering him a salary that my father had always refused to pay him. I was rapidly, quietly building a highly skilled army out of the exact people Preston had carelessly discarded. But navigating this war meant dealing with casualties and spies. I made the slight miscalculation of grabbing a quick beer with Dominic, the owner of a large rival shop across town, mistakenly thinking he was a friendly neutral party in the industry. I vaguely mentioned I was actively looking for commercial real estate to rapidly expand my operations. Exactly 2 days later, Fiona secretly texted me from an untraceable burner phone. Dominic had immediately called Preston, maliciously warning him that I was setting up a major competitor right in their backyard and had successfully poached Mr. Harrison's massive account. According to Fiona, Preston was reportedly furious, screaming at the top of his lungs in the main office, suddenly realizing his quiet little scapegoat was actually a massive, heavily armed threat. But Dominic's petty betrayal did not matter in the slightest, because my true target was already completely locked in. I was aiming much, much higher than just opening a simple competing shop. I was going for the throat. I had been doing deep, extensive legal research on the family business structure. My grandfather had built the physical shop, but during a devastating economic recession in the early 90s, he was forced to sell the actual commercial land beneath the building to a wealthy real estate developer named Elias to keep the business afloat and avoid bankruptcy. For 30 years, my family had merely leased the property from him. They owned the tools, the lifts, and the brand, but not the dirt underneath it. I aggressively scheduled a face-to-face meeting with Elias. He was a sharp, intimidating, strictly no-nonsense man in his late 70s who absolutely hated dealing with Victor's arrogance and thoroughly despised Preston's incompetence. I sat across from him in his plush, mahogany-paneled downtown office, wearing a clean, pressed button-down shirt, projecting the exact kind of professional stability and quiet confidence my brother entirely lacked. "Mr. Elias," I started, keeping my voice incredibly steady and calm. "I know for a fact that the lease on the auto shop property is up for renewal late next month. I also know, through highly reliable internal channels, that my brother is currently over 3 months behind on his rent payments." Elias raised a thick white eyebrow, leaning back deeply in his expensive leather chair, tenting his fingers. "Word travels incredibly fast in this industry, Julian. Your brother is a massive headache. He keeps dodging my calls and sending his terrified little assistant to make pathetic excuses about cash flow. I am having my lawyers prepare the formal eviction notices as we speak." "Don't evict him," I said quietly, locking eyes with him. Elias frowned deeply, a look of genuine confusion crossing his weathered face. "You are sitting in my office asking for a massive favor for the exact family that threw you out into the street without a dime?" "No, sir," I replied firmly, without blinking. "I am asking to buy the property entirely from you, free and clear." Elias stared at me for a long, heavy moment, silently assessing every inch of me. "Prime commercial real estate in that specific industrial zone is not cheap, Julian. You are a mechanic. Where is the capital coming from?" I did not hesitate. I pulled a thick, perfectly organized folder from my briefcase and slid it smoothly across the polished desk. It contained my verified YouTube revenue streams, my lucrative new sponsor contracts, an ironclad letter of intent backed directly by Mr. Harrison's massive private equity firm, and the full, untouched extent of my personal savings. I have the capital secured. But much more importantly, Mr. Elias, I have a motivation you can explicitly trust. I want my grandfather's legacy back, and I will maintain that property better than anyone else. Elias slowly opened the heavy folder, flipping meticulously through the financial pages. As he read the verified numbers, a slow, grim, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his face. He looked up at me, his sharp eyes gleaming with a predatory kind of respect. "You know, Julian," Elias said softly, leaning forward, "your arrogant brother came in here just last week, sweating bullets, trying to secure a massive secondary mortgage on the leasehold improvements to desperately pay off his angry vendors. But the legal paperwork he confidently handed me, it had your father's signature on it as the guarantor. A signature I have personally seen on contracts for over 30 years. I know a blatant forgery when I see one. Your brother is actively committing felony fraud." The large office went completely, dead silent. Preston had not just forged internal documents to blame me for his mess. He was actively committing massive federal financial crimes to illegally leverage a property he did not even own. He was completely out of his mind, drowning deeply in his own toxic arrogance and sheer panic. "I won't report the forgery to the authorities," Elias said smoothly, closing the folder with a satisfying thud. "Not yet, anyway. It is far too messy and time-consuming for me to deal with a criminal investigation on my property. I just want out of this entire headache. If you can have your bank wire the full funds to my escrow account by Friday at noon, the land is absolutely yours. You will officially be their landlord." I stood up and shook his hand firmly. When I walked out of that high-rise office building and into the bright sunlight, I felt a massive, physical shift in the entire universe. I had spent my entire life as an unwanted tenant in my own family, begging for a tiny scrap of space, begging for a shred of validation. Now, I officially owned the very ground they walked on. The stage was perfectly set for the final act. The annual Founders Auto Fair, the biggest, most prestigious classic car expo in the entire state, was exactly 2 weeks away. It was the one place where my family historically flexed their industry muscle and secured their biggest contracts for the year. I knew for an absolute fact that Preston and Victor would be there, desperately trying to secure new, wealthy clients to save their rapidly sinking ship. They were blindly walking into a massive, heavily armed legal ambush, and they had absolutely no idea the absolute hellfire I was about to rain down on them. The morning of the Founders Auto Fair arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air. It was the kind of early autumn morning in the Northeast that makes you feel entirely alive, where the frost still clings to the edges of the grass and your breath plumes in the cold air. I was up long before the sun even thought about rising. I stood in my dark, quiet kitchen, holding a mug of black coffee, feeling a strange, absolute sense of calm wash over my entire body. For my entire life, this specific weekend in October was a massive source of crushing anxiety. It was the weekend my father, Victor, would parade our family around the fairgrounds, aggressively shaking hands with wealthy collectors and treating me like the hired help, while Preston played the role of the visionary heir. Today was going to be completely different. Today, I was not the invisible grease monkey. I was the main event, and I held all the cards. I pulled my heavy truck into the massive fairgrounds just as the very first rays of golden sunlight began reflecting off the endless rows of polished chrome and immaculate, high-end paint jobs. The smell of high-octane fuel, aged leather, and breakfast sausages from the vendor tents filled the crisp air. It was a smell that felt like absolute home to me. My new team was already there, meticulously setting up our massive exhibition space right in the dead center of the main pavilion. I had invested a very significant portion of my early YouTube revenue into this specific display, knowing the return on investment would be monumental. We had massive, sleek black and bronze banners hanging from the high steel rafters reading Legacy Restorations, in bold, commanding lettering. But the real showstoppers were the cars. Mr. Harrison, true to his word and thoroughly disgusted with my family's lack of professionalism, had generously allowed me to display 3 of his most prized possessions. These were vehicles my team had recently tuned to absolute, flawless perfection. We had a pristine, cherry-red 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, a flawless vintage silver Porsche 356 Speedster, and a completely custom, incredibly aggressive midnight blue Shelby Cobra. They sat under the bright, focused pavilion lights like automotive royalty. Nolan was carefully wiping down the sweeping fender of the Ferrari with a microfiber cloth, grinning from ear to ear. He looked 10 years younger since he left Victor's toxic employment. Clara was efficiently organizing our sleek promotional materials and new client intake forms on a high-top table, wearing a branded jacket and looking completely in her element. She had already scheduled 3 new consultations before the gates even opened. And young Lucas, my eager apprentice, was nervously but proudly arranging the heavy steel tools on our mobile engine rig. I had brought a complete, disassembled V8 engine block to the fair. The strategic plan was to do a live, fully narrated rebuild right in front of the massive crowd, exactly like my viral videos, but in person. It was a massive flex of pure mechanical skill that Preston could never, ever replicate. By 9 in the morning, the massive iron gates opened, and the crowd began flooding into the pavilion. Within a single hour, our booth was completely swarmed. People recognized me immediately from the channel. They wanted to shake my hand, take pictures, and ask incredibly detailed questions about cylinder heads, transmission ratios, and the proper way to balance a crankshaft. I stood there, talking directly to these strangers who deeply respected my craft, and for the very first time in 29 years, I felt like I truly belonged somewhere. I was not a shadow living on a meager salary. I was a highly respected professional in my industry. Around noon, the massive crowd around our booth was 3 rows deep as I began the live engine teardown. I had a wireless microphone headset on, explaining the exact history of the intake manifold I was currently working on. The crowd was completely silent, watching my hands move with practiced, mechanical precision. And that is exactly when I finally saw them. The massive crowd parted slightly near the back edge of our sprawling display. And there they were, Victor and Preston. They looked absolutely terrible. They were both wearing their expensive, tailored Italian suits, but the expensive clothes looked strangely hollow and ill-fitting on them now. Victor looked like he had rapidly aged 10 years in the last 6 short months. His posture, usually so rigid and commanding, was slightly stooped, his shoulders rounded in defeat. His face was pale, drawn, and heavily lined with deep stress. Preston, on the other hand, looked utterly frantic. His eyes were darting around the massive pavilion with the manic energy of a cornered animal. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. I knew exactly why they were aimlessly walking the public floor instead of standing proudly behind a massive corporate booth. The fair organizers had quietly but firmly banned Taylor Auto from exhibiting this year due to multiple aggressive complaints of unfulfilled contracts, missing parts, and a massive wave of toxic bad press in the local industry circles. They were completely locked out of their own prestigious kingdom. They were walking the aisles desperately, trying to network and secure any kind of financial lifeline to save their rapidly sinking ship before the bank seized their assets. And then, Preston's bloodshot eyes locked directly onto our massive, glowing display. I watched the horrible realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He saw the $1 million Ferrari. He saw the massive, adoring crowd. He saw the high-quality banners with my name boldly printed on them. And most importantly, he saw Mr. Harrison, his former VIP client, standing proudly near the front of our booth, chatting happily with Clara about a new restoration project. I did not stop working. I kept my hands incredibly steady on the heavy steel wrench, finishing the exact torque sequence on a cylinder head bolt, and smoothly wrapped up that segment of the live demonstration. The crowd applauded warmly, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. I calmly took off the headset, grabbed a red shop towel to wipe the thin layer of grease from my hands, and walked slowly toward the edge of the booth, right to where the thick velvet ropes separated my secure territory from the public aisle. Preston simply could not handle it. His massive, incredibly fragile ego completely overrode whatever microscopic amount of common sense he had left in his brain. He marched directly toward me, aggressively pushing past a group of older, wealthy enthusiasts, with Victor trailing nervously and hesitantly behind him. "Well, well, well," Preston said loudly, aggressively projecting his voice so the wealthy people nearby would turn and look at us. He leaned heavily against the velvet rope post, crossing his arms over his chest, desperately trying to look incredibly bored and vastly superior. "Look who decided to set up a cute little circus tent. I have to admit, Julian, the rented cars are a nice, flashy touch. Are you trying to pretend you actually play in the big leagues now?" I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at him, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. "Hello, Preston. Nice of you to buy a general admission ticket to come see my work." His jaw twitched violently. He absolutely hated that I was completely calm. He desperately needed me to be the cowering, terrified little brother who used to clean up his messes. "You know, it's actually incredibly pathetic," Preston sneered, stepping much closer to the rope, so only I could hear the real, venomous desperation in his voice. "You steal my highly confidential client list. You set up this flashy little display to stroke your own massive ego, and you honestly think you're suddenly a real businessman. You are a mechanic, Julian. You belong under a dirty car, covered in grease. You have absolutely no idea how the real corporate world works." "I know enough to pay my hard-working vendors on time," I said quietly, locking eyes with him and refusing to look away. Preston's face flushed a deep, ugly, mottled red. He quickly glanced around nervously to see if anyone in the wealthy crowd had heard that specific comment. "You think you are so incredibly smart," he hissed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Did you get the certified letter from my lawyer? Because this little public charade you are putting on right now, it just proves my exact legal case. You are actively trying to sabotage the family business. You took proprietary company secrets when you were fired. I am going to hit you with a massive lawsuit for every single penny you make off that stupid little internet channel. I will drag you through a brutal, multi-year legal battle until you are begging for a minimum wage job at Walmart. He was aggressively doubling down. He was standing right on the absolute edge of a massive cliff, staring directly down at the jagged rocks below, and he consciously decided to put a blindfold on and sprint forward. He genuinely, truly believed his own fabricated lies. He thought his aggressive legal threats and the mere mention of a high-powered lawyer would make me fold completely, that I would quietly hand over my legitimate profits to save him from the total financial ruin he single-handedly created. It was the absolute, fatal trap of extreme complacency. He was so incredibly used to winning just by being the anointed golden child that he completely underestimated the quiet, observant guy who had spent his entire life studying the structural blueprints of the building. I looked past Preston's red, sweating face and saw my father, Victor. He was staring at the flawless, gleaming Ferrari, then staring at me. He looked completely and utterly lost, like a man who had woken up on a different planet. "Julian," Victor said, his voice weak, completely lacking its usual booming, terrifying thunder. "We really need to talk. Not here in front of everyone. In private. Please." "We have absolutely nothing to talk about in private, Victor," I replied evenly, loudly enough for the wealthy prospective clients nearby to hear exactly where I stood. "If you have something important to say to me, you can say it right here, in broad daylight, in front of my dedicated team and my loyal clients." Preston slammed his open hand down hard on the metal velvet rope post. "Don't you dare disrespect Dad like that in public. You owe this family your entire life. You are going to step aside right now, you are going to properly introduce me to these new prospects, and we are going to quietly settle this massive lawsuit you brought upon yourself. If you cooperate and hand over the accounts, maybe I'll tell the corporate lawyers to take it easy on you." I looked at Preston. I looked deeply at the sheer, terrifying delusion swimming in his bloodshot eyes. He actually thought he was in total control. He thought he was the apex predator in the room, dictating the terms of my surrender. I smiled. It was not a warm, happy smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of a man who had just firmly and permanently locked the heavy steel doors of a cage from the outside. "I am not introducing you to a single person, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the massive pavilion like a freshly sharpened razor blade. "And there is no impending lawsuit, because you cannot afford to keep a lawyer on retainer. And even if you could somehow scrape the cash together, they would drop you as a client the absolute second they looked at your actual accounting books." I watched the initial wave of pure panic wash over his face, and I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. The trap was officially sprung. The precise moment the words left my mouth, the entire atmosphere around our sprawling booth shifted completely. The ambient, low-level chatter of the surrounding crowd seemed to suddenly and completely die down. Mr. Harrison, who had been deeply engaged in a conversation with Clara about sourcing parts for a vintage Aston Martin, slowly turned around. His sharp, highly observant eyes locked onto the unfolding confrontation. Nolan stepped up right behind my right shoulder, crossing his massive, muscular arms over his chest, forming a silent, intimidating wall of pure support. Preston let out a harsh, incredibly fake, high-pitched laugh, though his panicked eyes darted nervously around the gathering crowd. "What the hell are you even babbling about now? My corporate books are perfectly fine. You are completely delusional, Julian. The immense stress of trying to run a fake little business is clearly breaking your fragile mind." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my clean, branded jacket. I did not pull out a wrench or a diagnostic tool. I pulled out a neatly folded, thick stack of official, highly sensitive financial papers. I slowly unfolded them, smoothing the creases, and held them casually in my right hand. "I am talking about the massive, gaping million-dollar holes in your main operating accounts, Preston," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady, projecting just enough so the VIP clients standing nearby could hear every single damning word. "I am talking about the brand-new, top-of-the-line luxury sports car you illegally purchased last month using the company's tax ID. I am talking about the highly illegal shell company you hastily created for Gemma, actively funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of company revenue into a completely fake marketing agency, all while our grandfather's oldest, most loyal vendors go completely unpaid. Victor physically stumbled backward, as if I had just swung a heavy sledgehammer directly into his chest. He stared at me, his jaw completely slack, his mouth hanging open. "Julian, what? What are you saying?" "Preston explicitly told me the vendors were unpaid because of the terrible, predatory contracts you signed right before we let you go." I turned my absolute, undivided attention to my father. For the very first time in my entire life, I was looking down at him, both physically and morally. "He lied to you, Victor. He has been lying to your face since the exact day you handed him the keys to the kingdom. He completely drained the corporate accounts to fund his own pathetic, flashy lifestyle, and when the liquid cash ran out, he fabricated federal documents to blindly blame me. He told the external auditors I was the one committing corporate sabotage to hide his massive theft." "Shut up!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently, echoing off the steel rafters of the pavilion. The charming, sophisticated CEO facade had completely melted away, revealing the terrified, cornered, incompetent coward underneath. "He's lying to you, Dad. He's just trying to humiliate us in public. He illegally forged those papers." "Did I actively forge the massive secondary mortgage application too, Preston?" I asked quietly, dropping the ultimate bomb. The entire world seemed to abruptly stop spinning for Preston. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. He took a shaky, unstable step back, bumping hard into the velvet rope. "What secondary mortgage?" Victor demanded, his voice suddenly incredibly sharp, a brief flicker of his old, terrifying anger returning to his eyes. But this time, the absolute fury was aimed directly at his golden child. "Preston, what the hell is he talking about? Our commercial lease strictly and explicitly forbids leveraging the property without the landlord's consent." "He went to Elias last week," I said, addressing Victor directly, completely ignoring Preston's silent, panicked, shallow gasps for air. "He desperately tried to secure a massive, high-interest loan against the leasehold improvements to quietly cover the massive debts he created. But Elias firmly rejected it." "Do you want to know exactly why he rejected it, Victor?" Victor was physically trembling now. His hands shook at his sides. "Why?" "Because the legal guarantor signature on the bottom of the loan application was yours," I said, my voice completely cold, devoid of even a microscopic shred of mercy. "And Elias knows your exact handwriting. Preston illegally forged your signature on federal financial documents. He committed felony fraud, Victor. He was perfectly willing to risk sending you to federal prison to cover his own tracks and protect his unearned salary." Victor slowly, mechanically turned his head to look at Preston. The look of absolute, devastating, world-shattering betrayal on his aged face was almost physically painful to watch. The mighty, untouchable patriarch, the man who had ruthlessly discarded me like absolute trash, was finally, brutally realizing that he had handed his entire life's work to a vicious parasite. A parasite that had consumed what should have been an inheritance, a massive retirement fund, and a legacy. "Tell me he is lying," Victor whispered to Preston, his voice breaking. "Tell me right now that your brother is making this up." Preston couldn't speak a single word. He just shook his head rapidly, looking desperately for an exit, looking for a way to rapidly spin the narrative. But there was absolutely nowhere to hide. The bright, unforgiving lights of the exhibition pavilion were shining directly on his absolute, undeniable failure. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, stopping right beside me, shoulder to shoulder. He looked at Preston with sheer, unfiltered disgust. "I pulled my entire exotic collection from your shop because you are a careless, arrogant fool, Preston. You treated my investments like toys. But I didn't realize you were an actual desperate criminal. You are an absolute disgrace to this entire industry." Preston looked wildly at the small, wealthy crowd that had tightly gathered around us, listening intently to every single word. His professional reputation was not just slightly damaged. It was completely, entirely, irreversibly eradicated. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated, toxic hatred. "You think you won?" Preston spat, actual spit flying from his trembling lips. "You think just because you exposed a minor cash flow problem that you beat me? I still legally own the company, Julian. The brand name is mine. You are still just a dirty mechanic renting a bay in a depressing strip mall. You are absolutely nothing." I let out a slow, deep, incredibly satisfying breath. The final moment had finally arrived. The absolute culmination of months of intense discipline, late nights, and brilliant strategic planning. "You're absolutely right, Preston," I said calmly, folding the financial papers and sliding them back into my jacket. "You do legally own the LLC. You own the heavy lifts, the broken tools, and you own the massive, crushing pile of debt. But there is one major, critical thing you do not own." I reached into my other pocket one final time and pulled out a heavy, officially notarized legal document enclosed in a thick blue folder, bearing the raised seal of the county clerk. I held it up so the bright overhead lights caught the gold legal stamp. "You don't own the dirt," I said. Victor and Preston both stared at the blue legal folder in utter, paralyzing confusion. Yesterday morning at exactly 10 a.m., my LLC officially wired the full, multi-million-dollar purchase price directly to Elias's private escrow account, I announced, my voice echoing slightly in the massive, quiet space. "The commercial deed transfer has been completely finalized and recorded with the county clerk. I bought the commercial real estate, Victor. The exact land your failing shop sits on now legally belongs entirely to me." Victor's knees physically buckled. He had to reach out and grab the heavy metal velvet rope post just to keep from collapsing entirely onto the hard concrete floor. "No," Victor gasped, aggressively shaking his head in total, desperate denial. "No, Elias wouldn't do that. We have a 30-year professional relationship." Elias aggressively wanted out of a highly toxic relationship with a bankrupt tenant who actively commits felony forgery on his premises. I corrected him sharply. "So, he gladly sold it to a verified cash buyer. Me." I took exactly 2 steps forward, completely closing the distance between myself and the toxic family that had mercilessly thrown me away. I looked directly, deeply into Victor's wide, horrified eyes, then shifted my cold gaze to Preston's completely terrified, sweating face. "I am officially your new landlord," I said, the words tasting incredibly sweet and powerful on my tongue. "And seeing as you are currently over 3 months severely delinquent on your massive commercial rent, and you have actively, flagrantly violated the strict terms of the commercial lease by attempting fraudulent loans against the property, I am aggressively exercising my legal right to terminate your tenancy." I handed the notarized eviction document directly to Preston, slapping it firmly and loudly against his chest. He reflexively grabbed it with violently trembling hands, staring down at the bold legal print. "That is your official, non-negotiable 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I said coldly. "You have exactly 1 month to pack up your tools, take down your fake branded signs, and get off my property. If you leave a single drop of oil on my floor after 30 days, I will have the county sheriff forcefully drag you out in handcuffs, and I will personally hand the forged loan applications directly to the district attorney." Preston looked down at the official eviction notice, his hands shaking so violently the thick paper rattled audibly. He looked up at me, completely and utterly shattered. The arrogant, untouchable CEO was completely gone. In his place was just a terrified, pathetic little boy who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. Victor looked at me, actual tears welling up in his aged, tired eyes. The desperate tears from the late-night voicemails. The agonizing tears of a man who realized he had backed the absolute wrong son, and it had cost him his entire life's work. "Julian, please," Victor begged, his voice completely broken, stripping away decades of pride. "That shop is my entire life. It's your grandfather's legacy. You can't just take it away from us. We are family." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, hard, permanent closure. "You told me to pack my things, Victor?" I said quietly, the absolute finality ringing clear in the silent pavilion. I didn't argue. I just left. Now it's your turn. I turned my back on them completely and walked back to my loyal team, leaving them standing in the ashes of their own arrogance. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate, explosive fallout of the founder's auto fair was utterly absolute and highly destructive. Word travels at the absolute speed of light in the tight-knit, highly gossipy high-end automotive community. By the very end of the weekend, every single major collector, vendor, and mechanic in a 200-mile radius knew that Taylor Auto was essentially completely bankrupt, facing a massive commercial eviction, and deeply embroiled in serious, impending allegations of federal financial fraud. Exactly 1 week later, I was sitting comfortably in the small, newly renovated office of my temporary shop, going over the final, highly profitable payroll sheets with Clara, when I saw a massive, pristine luxury SUV pull aggressively into the small parking lot. The driver's side door opened, and my mother, Sylvia, stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. She was wearing her signature oversized designer sunglasses and carrying a large, incredibly expensive leather tote bag. She looked incredibly, almost comically out of place walking past the heavy machinery, the loud air compressors, and the grease-covered mechanics in my bustling shop. I told Clara to hold all my incoming calls, stood up from my desk, and walked out to the main shop floor to intercept her before she could disrupt my team's workflow. "Julian," Sylvia said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, incredibly fake maternal warmth that immediately set my teeth on edge. She reached out her arms to hug me, a gesture she hadn't genuinely initiated in over a decade, but I took a deliberate, firm step back, crossing my arms over my chest. Her perfectly practiced smile faltered slightly, her eyes flashing with brief irritation, but she quickly recovered, reaching into her expensive designer tote bag. She pulled out an old, slightly faded photograph encased in a heavy silver frame. It was a picture of me when I was exactly 10 years old, standing proudly next to Grandpa Vincent in the old shop, holding a massive wrench that was entirely too big for my small hands. "I was cleaning out the attic this morning," Sylvia said softly, looking at the photo with a masterfully practiced look of deep, painful nostalgia. "I found this hidden away. I wanted you to have it immediately. I know how much you loved him, Julian. And he loved you so much. He would want us to be together." I stared blankly at the photograph. 6 months ago, receiving that specific picture from my mother might have broken my heart. It might have made me desperately reach out, hoping against hope for some sort of genuine reconciliation. But now, after Fiona had explicitly exposed the absolute depth of their calculated betrayal, I saw the photograph exactly for what it was. A cheap, highly calculated, incredibly manipulative weapon of emotional warfare. "Cut the act, Sylvia," I said, my voice completely flat, dead, and devoid of any emotion. "You didn't drive 50 miles out of your way to my shop to bring me a childhood memory. What do you actually want?" She sighed heavily, dramatically dropping her shoulders, fully playing the role of the exhausted, deeply burdened matriarch trying to hold her broken family together. "Your father is completely falling apart, Julian. His blood pressure is through the roof, and the doctors are incredibly worried. And Preston is in very, very serious trouble. The vendors are aggressively filing massive civil lawsuits. And the bank caught wind of the irregularities with the loan paperwork." "You mean the felony forgery?" I corrected her sharply, refusing to let her soften the reality of the crimes. She visibly winced at the harsh legal word, looking around nervously at my mechanics. "Julian, please keep your voice down. He is your older brother. He made a terrible, incredibly foolish mistake under immense, crushing pressure. But if they press formal criminal charges, he could actually go to federal prison. His life would be completely, permanently ruined. Gemma already packed up all her expensive things and left him the second she heard the word bankruptcy. He is entirely alone and terrified. And how exactly is any of this my problem? I asked, staring her down. Sylvia stepped closer, invading my personal space, lowering her voice to a desperate whisper, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. You have significant money now, Julian. You own the massive commercial property. You have these incredibly wealthy clients like Harrison backing you. You could easily take out a small mortgage on the land, pay off his most aggressive debts, and hire a top-tier defense lawyer to get the impending cases dropped. Just to keep your brother out of jail. We are family, Julian. We have to fiercely stick together when times get hard. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the utter, absolute, terrifying lack of shame in her cold eyes. She had silently watched my father throw me out into the freezing street without a single penny to my name. She had sat there quietly, eating her dinner, while they tried to ruthlessly extort me and legally frame me for corporate sabotage. And now, she had the absolute, unbelievable audacity to stand in the middle of my highly successful shop and aggressively demand that I leverage my hard-earned assets and put my own financial future at massive risk to save the precious golden child from the legal consequences of his own severe crimes. You don't want a son? I said quietly, the absolute, crushing finality of the statement hanging heavy in the air between us. You want a walking wallet. You want a massive, free insurance policy for Preston's catastrophic failures. Julian, how can you be so incredibly, heartlessly cold? She gasped, clutching the silver picture frame dramatically to her chest as if I had physically struck her in the face. I learned it directly from watching you, I replied. I turned around and looked at Nolan, who was watching the entire exchange closely from the next bay, holding a tire iron. Nolan, please escort this woman off my private property immediately. If she refuses to leave the premises in 30 seconds, call the local police and have her officially trespassed. Sylvia's mouth dropped open in sheer, unadulterated shock. You wouldn't dare. Watch me, I said. I turned my back on her entirely and walked straight back into my private office, firmly shutting the heavy glass door. I stood at the window and watched impassively as Nolan calmly, but incredibly firmly, directed my visibly shaking mother back to her luxury SUV. She aggressively threw the silver frame into the passenger seat, slammed the heavy door, and sped away, completely empty-handed. That was the absolute last time I ever spoke to my mother. The collapse of their toxic empire was incredibly swift and exceptionally brutal. Within 2 weeks of the fair, Preston completely cracked under the intense, relentless pressure of the impending lawsuits and the sheer, paralyzing terror of the active federal investigation. He officially filed for massive corporate bankruptcy, hoping it would shield him. But bankruptcy absolutely does not protect you from criminal fraud charges. Elias, completely fed up with the entire dramatic situation and wanting to protect his own pristine reputation, had quietly handed the forged real estate documents over to his aggressive legal team, who instantly passed them directly to the district attorney's office. Preston was formally arrested on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The local news channel ran a brief, highly embarrassing segment on it, detailing the massive fall from grace for the former CEO of a respected local legacy brand. He eventually took a heavy, restrictive plea deal to avoid serious federal prison time, resulting in massive financial restitution fines, 5 years of strict probation, and a permanent felony record that permanently destroyed any chance of him ever working in a corporate management position again. Last I heard through the industry grapevine, he was working as a junior sales rep at a low-end, highly predatory used car lot 2 towns over, desperately trying to sell fake extended warranties to people with terrible credit. As for the commercial property, the 30-day eviction notice was strictly and aggressively enforced by my lawyers. Victor and Preston were forced to completely liquidate absolutely everything inside the building just to pay their exorbitant legal retainers. They sold the heavy hydraulic lifts, the expensive electronic diagnostic machines, the remaining inventory, and even my grandfather's beautiful vintage oak desk. On the 31st day, I drove my heavy truck onto the property. The massive industrial garage doors were securely locked, and the building was entirely empty. I stood in the parking lot and watched a hired crew carefully take down the massive, illuminated Taylor Auto sign from the front of the brick building. The heavy plastic letters left pale, ghostly shadows on the weathered brickwork, a fading, pathetic memory of a deeply toxic empire that had completely destroyed itself from the inside out. Exactly 1 year later, I was standing in the exact same spot on the property, but the entire world had completely, fundamentally changed. The fading, ghostly shadows on the brickwork had been completely covered by a massive, sleek new sign made of heavy, oxidized bronze and matte black steel. It simply read, "Legacy Restorations, founded by Julian." The transition back to the main building had taken massive amounts of exhausting, back-breaking work, countless long nights, and immense capital, but we had successfully moved my entire operation into the original massive facility. We completely renovated the interior from the ground up, gleefully tearing out Preston's ridiculous, flashy executive lounge with sledgehammers and turning it back into a highly functional, state-of-the-art clean room specifically designed for complex, high-end engine rebuilds. The shop was absolutely booming beyond my wildest dreams. We were completely booked out for 14 solid months. Mr. Harrison had brought 3 of his incredibly wealthy friends into our exclusive client ecosystem, and the YouTube channel had officially crossed the monumental 1 million subscriber mark, providing a massive secondary income stream. I was no longer just the quiet, resentful guy turning wrenches in the dark background, hoping for a tiny scrap of validation. I was a highly respected CEO, a recognized master mechanic, and the absolute, undisputed owner of my own destiny. I had provided full, comprehensive health insurance and massive quarterly bonuses for Clara, Nolan, Fiona, and the rest of my incredibly dedicated team. Young Lucas, my eager apprentice, had just successfully completed his very first solo rebuild on a classic 1967 Mustang, and the immense, shining pride in his eyes when the engine roared to life reminded me exactly of why I loved this trade in the first place. I had successfully built the exact, supportive family I always desperately wanted, not bound by toxic bloodlines, but entirely by shared respect, absolute loyalty, and incredibly hard work. As for my biological family, they became nothing more than distant, pathetic, cautionary ghosts. Victor had suffered a minor heart attack shortly after the brutal bankruptcy proceedings were finalized. He survived the medical scare, but the immense stress and the total, humiliating loss of his precious social status in the community had completely broken his arrogant spirit. He moved into a much smaller, incredibly modest condo on the outskirts of town with Sylvia, surviving strictly on whatever meager scraps were left of his retirement funds after the aggressive lawyers took their massive cut. About 6 months ago, I found a thick, heavy, handwritten envelope sitting in my secure business mailbox. The return address printed in the corner was Victor's new, cheap condo. I held the heavy letter in my grease-stained hands for a long moment, staring at his familiar, rigid handwriting. I knew exactly, precisely what was inside those pages. It would be a long, rambling, highly manipulative apology, heavily laced with subtle excuses, intense guilt trips about his rapidly failing health, and a desperate, pathetic plea to let him back into my life so he could feel like a respected patriarch one last time. He wanted access to my success. I didn't open it. I didn't even tear the paper seal. I simply walked over to the massive industrial trash can by the main bay doors and dropped it directly into the garbage, right next to a pile of completely ruined, rusted-out brake pads. It was the most incredibly liberating, deeply powerful feeling in the entire world. I had finally, permanently established my absolute boundaries. I realized in that exact moment that true, deep forgiveness does not always mean granting highly toxic people access back into your hard-earned life. Sometimes, true forgiveness just means letting go of the heavy, burning anger so you can finally use both of your hands to aggressively build your own beautiful future. Later that evening, long after the heavy shop doors were securely locked, the hydraulic lifts were lowered, and the rest of the crew had gone home to their families, I stayed behind. The massive shop was incredibly quiet, smelling deeply and wonderfully of clean motor oil, fresh paint, and raw, unlimited potential. I walked slowly into the main office and looked at the back wall. Right in the absolute center, perfectly framed under a warm spotlight, was the old, faded photograph of me and my grandfather, Vincent. The exact one my mother had desperately tried to use as a cheap weapon of emotional manipulation. I had taken it from her, not out of nostalgic weakness, but to completely and permanently reclaim the powerful memory from their toxic grip. I looked at my grandfather's strong, heavily calloused hands resting securely on my young shoulders. I finally, truly understood the deep, philosophical lesson he had always patiently tried to teach me, a lesson that went far beyond classic cars, carburetors, and real estate. He always used to look at me, wipe the grease from his brow, and say, "Julian, you don't win a fight by burning down the entire garage in a fit of rage. You win the war by quietly, meticulously building a vastly superior engine." They had aggressively tried to completely burn my life down to the ground. They had actively tried to take my dignity, my inheritance, my massive talent, and my professional freedom through lawsuits and lies. But I did not fight their massive fire with more destructive fire. I simply stepped out of the toxic flames, gathered my heavy tools, and built something so incredibly powerful, so massively undeniable, and so deeply true to my core values, that the dark, choking smoke from their absolute collapse couldn't possibly hide my glowing success anymore. I reclaimed my grandfather's true legacy by permanently removing the toxic people who had poisoned it. I was finally truly free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. It was incredibly difficult to share these dark moments, but I genuinely hope that if there is someone out there right now, sitting quietly at a toxic family dinner table, feeling completely invisible, unvalued, and trapped, you know that you have the absolute power to walk away and build your own incredible empire. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family, where the golden child destroyed everything while you did all the heavy lifting? Share your personal story